would like to start this meeting just giving way to a brief video by Gadamer itself, and he focuses on one of the capital or main concerns of philosophical hermeneutics as understood by Gadamer, and it shows why Stanley's work is such a decisive work for us to think about our present, our past, and our future. It's just a few minutes. It is in German, but it's subtitled in Spanish. And those of you who wish may listen to the English reading of the subtitles. To understand oneself, as I have said on this topic, it consists on understanding one another's. To understand others means that you understand others, and this is moral, not logical. Human task is the hardest one of all. We live in that science, the science of a big monologue. And in fact, it is about matter and only about matter that you can establish certainties, control, effectiveness that have been shed throughout the years. However, it is evidently about another issue in our world, and for all of us, including science and its research, we need to think how we will direct our existence in an adequate, that is profoundly adequate, not just as a means for world domination. We need to think, we need to learn to see that others are our first frontier, our first border of self-love. And our egocentrism in general, well, that is the moral problem. And it's also a political problem, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot exaggerate how serious this topic is this week. And this has to do with the fact that we need to really learn how to coexist with one another within acceptance of differences, cultures, and languages, and linguistic traditions. We need to slowly learn to deviate language productivity of this system of rules with which we have a difference between the right and wrong when we talk, especially when we want to make others understand and we want to make ourselves be understood by others, and that we can then answer to others, not confirm, not correct, but rather what you do in a correct, conventional conversation. Thank you very much. I will now let Marina introduce Dr. Anozie, and we will begin. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Stanley. It's a real privilege for us to have you here. Professor Stanley Uche Anozie teaches philosophy, the personal and social responsibility at Boston College, Massachusetts, USA. He's a Boston College Pulse Program faculty member. The PULSE program is a service learning program. It's about positive participation in community initiatives. He taught philosophy and ethics at the University of Indianapolis, Indiana, in the US. He taught indigenous religions in global contexts at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Anozie is a co-director of Alternative Perspectives and Global Concerns at an Ottawa-based scholarly organization and a consultative status organization with UN ECOSOC, which stands for Economic and Social Council, and UN Committee of the States on NGOs, UNESCO. He was a contributor to Canada and Challenges of International Development and Globalization, a nominated finalist for the 2019 Prose Award by Association of American Publishers, Professional and Scholarly Publishing Division. He's an editorial board member of International Journey of Philosophy. Welcome, Anozie, and the floor is yours.
All right. ¿Cómo estás? Buenos días. Hola. It is my pleasure to be part of today's intellectual collaboration, where I would like to articulate my position, which has been communicated in my recent publication entitled Gadamer, an African Hermeneutic Philosophy. I would like to proceed with this presentation by providing what Gadamer himself will consider as hermeneutical situation or historical situation, a kind of narrative to help appreciate where I'm coming from, the motive or the reason for my project, for my work, as well as my aspiration in terms of making indigenous philosophy, African philosophy, or whatever philosophy as an acceptable way of doing philosophy. I consider this approach as part of the narrative of philosophy of diversity and inclusiveness, where the different voices, different cultures and civilizations of the world are recognized for what they are, listened to, not considered as foreign in the sense of being strange, of being meaningless, of not having anything to contribute to the totality of humanity. That is the motive of my work. And so for the presentation today, I will focus on Gadamer, an African hermeneutic philosophy. When I'm focusing on this topic, the background is what I think very important. My background, my philosophical journey. And here is my story. Some years ago in Nigeria, as a student of philosophy, I read a number of texts based on Western philosophical ideas, or what you may consider to be European-based philosophy. I read about Plato, I read about Aristotle, I read about medieval philosophers like Augustine, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, and the rest of them. I as well read about modern philosophers. I read about René Descartes and his philosophy of cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And I thought it is a philosophy that is founded on individualism rather than on the communitarian notion of the human person. I also read works like Immanuel Kant's project that reflected on humanism or humanity, the principle of universalization, the principle of humanism or humanity, the principle of autonomy, and what I added to be the principle of rationality. I felt that that progress in that philosophical thought kind of gave me a sense that within the European philosophical tradition, a human being is not just an individual, but a human person, a relatable being. And then further on, I read about Martin Buber's project, I and Thou, or what is in German considered to be Ich und Du. I read about between man and man, or what could be translated to be between person and person. I read about Emmanuel Levinas, the idea of the otherness. I also read about Gabriel Marcel's narrative on authenticity and inauthenticity and interpersonal relationship. I was able to come to the conclusion that although some of the narratives of Western or European philosophy emphasized on individualism, on being individual, on being a unit, I thought that other aspects of their philosophical traditions communicated what resonated with the African philosophical worldview. And so I wrote my project on colonialism, the bane of African development. Why? Because I could not really understand why the philosophy of person that communicates relatedness, community, family, togetherness, how that philosophy would influence colonialism, the enslavement of the other, the estrangement of the other from his or her own community, which is part of the essential narrative of slavery and the movement or the transatlantic slavery movement, where Africans were moved from Africa to parts of America. This also influenced my interest in philosophy, whereby I try to focus on getting the best from my learning philosophy, Western philosophy, and seeing how I can tie that to what is beneficial to my own people, the African people, the Igbo people. And then in my subsequent philosophical journey, especially when I came to Canada, I wrote my master's degree thesis on authentic integration process in Canada, a contemporary African concept of the human person. In other words, you could see the trajectory of my philosophical journey. Yes, we have to have relevant narrative understanding of what is obtainable within the Western world, or what is obtainable within the philosophical tradition of Europe. At the same time, we have to pay attention to what is possible, the philosophical possibility and the richness of African philosophy and worldviews. Since then, I began to put topics of Western/European to African philosophical narrative. Then when it was time for me to do my PhD, I was really fascinated and influenced by the works of Hans-Georg Gadamer, especially picking up the text of Truth and Method, Wahrheit und Methode. I also was fascinated by his philosophical hermeneutics. I was fascinated by much of his work on the relevance of the beautiful and other aces. These really provided me with a foundational knowledge where to plug in African philosophy. And then I thought about one of the basic books that has communicated the idea of African progressive philosophy, what I may call the philosophy of well-being, the philosophy of emancipation, the philosophy of liberation, the philosophy of well-being. That I found in the 1958 book written by Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. And so it became an opportunity for me to put together Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method and Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart. In a way that becomes a center of reconciliation. So Martin Buber, for me, rather Immanuel Kant and Heidegger and all these philosophers were summarized, so to say, in the welcoming framework provided by Hans-Georg Gadamer. So Europe is not all about colonization. Europe is not all about the empowerment of the Western people. There is something in Europe that talks about how to be human enough, how to be a listening person. And that I found in the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer. And then with Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, I felt this provides a central text where literature, wisdom, and philosophy of a people could be put together and communicated to the world. That is my inspiration. That is my drive. However, it has not been so fun, if I'm gonna put it in American sense, it has never been so fun, trying to put to the fore, to the present, that there is African philosophy. I remember as a student in Canada, it almost took forever to convince professors that philosophy is not just Immanuel Kant, philosophy is not just Martin Heidegger, philosophy is not just about Plato and Aristotle. As long as there is a people, as long as there is a language, then there is a philosophy. If we recognize that there is European philosophy, if we recognize that there is Jewish philosophy, if we recognize there is a Mexican philosophy, if we recognize that there is Latin American philosophy of liberation, then there has to be a place for African philosophy. However, I've chosen to call it African hermeneutic philosophy, because I do think that hermeneutics is at the foundation of understanding reality. Whether you're looking at reality from a universal perspective, which is a universal theory of truth, or looking at reality from an empirical perspective, or looking at reality from a correspondence theory of truth, or looking at reality from a coherence theory of truth, or what I've added from a hermeneutical theory of truth, it is important. It is important to listen to the diverse traditions and to recognize that philosophy is a possibility as long as there is a human being, or there is humanity, as well as there is language. Having said that, I would like to proceed with the text as I have it, such a way that we have a guide in terms of our narrative. I would like to share the screen. I'll proceed with Hans-Georg Gadamer. Gadamer was so much interested in reaching out to the other, to people around him, and to establish that truth is not just the ontological or the universal understanding of it. Truth is much more than that. Truth is not merely a scientific object to be investigated. As long as we have human beings, as long as we have human sciences, truth should be able to emerge through dialogue or the fusion of horizons. In other words, hermeneutics or philosophical hermeneutics is about understanding the other. It's about understanding the text. It's about understanding the philosophy of the other. It is about communication. You may call it interpretation. All it's about is getting meaning from the other, understanding the other in order to have a peaceful coexistence with the other. That is what I consider simply as the idea of philosophical hermeneutics. In reading the text of Hans-Georg Gadamer, one is able to see, especially his work, Truth and Method, one is able to see the hermeneutical themes or themes that guided his idea of philosophy, philosophical thinking. One of them is the fusion of horizon, that we are all coming from different cultural perspective or historical conditions or hermeneutical situations. There is always a sense of bias, not necessarily a negative bias, but positive. Your background, your story, where you're coming from. For example, today I'm speaking and reaching out to us from Boston, Massachusetts, and you are listening to me from different diverse areas of the world. These are part of your historical conditions, and these are the points of your own fusion of horizon. Horizon is your range of vision. Horizon is the context of your own existence. Horizon is part of your own experience. And that is, according to Hans-Georg Gadamer, is something that one cannot overlook, but one can be cautious or prudent in order to know that these conditions, or what you may call prejudice or bias, are not of negative effect, but from a positive light. By way of putting it, it's like a contextual influence that helped enrich who you are. For example, my introductory comment about my philosophical journey is part of my fusion of horizon, is part of my horizon, is part of my context of existence. And so that is the point by Gadamer. Now, the other point by Gadamer that I think is very important is what he considered as temporal distance. You know, in whatever context that you communicate from, there is a history, there is a distance, there is something that happened before, there is the present, and there is the future. Now, another point by Gadamer that I think is very important is what he considered to be historical consciousness, or you may call it effective historical consciousness, the history behind your story, the history of life, the influences that carried one along. Maybe you may consider that from the perspective of dialectics, what made things what they are and what inspired things as they are. They are the historical narratives that we may not necessarily are able to change, but they're part of the context that we live in. For example, the story of exploitation, the story of the enslavement of the African people is part of my historical, effective historical consciousness in trying to put African philosophy or indigenous philosophy to the fore of philosophical debate. of trying to emphasize on philosophy of diversity and philosophy of inclusiveness. That is what Gadamer considers to be effective historical consciousness. Another point that Gadamer uses, or a theme that he uses in his philosophical hermeneutics, is the idea of hermeneutical cycle, the idea of going back and forth. If you want to understand the book, you don't just look at the title, you have to read the language, you have to read the words, and from the words to the sentences, from the sentences to the paragraphs, from the paragraphs to the pages, from the pages to the chapters, and then you're able to go back and forth in order to have a total understanding of the meaning or the message this book is trying to communicate to you. You may also relate it to the idea of having a debate or discussion, for example, in the classroom. When the professor is teaching, the students are listening. And so the students will at some point have questions to ask and present their understanding of what is being communicated to them. What happens when the professor listens to the students, he's able to clarify unclear areas of his or her presentation. That is part of hermeneutical circle. And that is what it means. The fusion of horizon, the going back and forth, the dialogue, the debate that helps us to come to the truth, to come to the message, and come to meaning. These are, like I said, important themes in order for us to understand where Gadamer is coming from, his message of philosophical hermeneutics. Now, I would like to use this message or this information, or what you may consider as the framework, in order to address the primary text that I see here, The Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe was an Igbo philosopher. Chinua Achebe was an African philosopher. Based on his educational background, he had a similar experience in terms of education, where his educational system emphasized much about the Western and the European pedagogy or understanding or information process. He didn't really see the face of his people in what was being communicated to him at the university. He was especially not excited by the work by Conrad on The Heart of Darkness. He felt it was a prejudiced narrative about his people. And so he felt the African people, or in this case, the Igbo people, should have a voice in communicating their own philosophy of life. And so he wrote the story, Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart, as much as we know it, and from the perspective of Chinua Achebe, it's a fictional text. It didn't really happen, but it communicated a message about his people. Especially, it offered him the opportunity to tell his own story. That reminds me about one of the works by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, another contemporary African literature writer, as the case may be. She talks about the issue of single narratives, single story. We have to tell our own story, not just from Eurocentric perspective or pro-Western philosophical perspective. There has to be this dialogue, the dialogue of plurality, the dialogue of diversity, as well as the dialogue of inclusiveness. So in Chinua Achebe's work, the main character there is considered to be Mr. Okonkwo. And it's so interesting to know that in the philosophy of the Igbo people, we communicate names with profound message. Okonkwo simply means in Igbo, a man born on Nkwo Day. Nkwo is a market day. For example, in Igbo philosophy, there are 4 days in a week. The first day is called Eke. The second day is called Orie. The third day is called Afo. The fourth one is called Nkwo. So you could see from the name Ukunkwo, man or a person born on Nkwo day, the fourth day. And so without this indigenous linguistic knowledge, it would have been totally difficult for one to really understand what the role of Okunkwo is in Things Fall Apart, and why he is, so to say, a character to communicate Igbo African personhood or personage, as the case may be. If you look at the narrative too, there are names like Nwafo. Nwafo is someone born on another market day, which is the third market day. So these are the importance of language names in philosophical thinking. I would like to use this opportunity to express, for example, my name, Uche, in Igbo means the will of God, especially when you use it in the full sense, Uche, Chuku. But once you use the short form, U-C-H-E, it's talking about divinity, the will of God, divine providence, and divine guidance. And so that is always very exciting to have a historical background, a historical knowledge of the language of the people, as well as the philosophy that communicates how these people look at reality. Moving from Okonkwo's name and my name, I would like to make reference to other Igbo names like Ndokako. It is a name that resonates with the ethics of the Igbo people. Life is more than wealth. Life is more than wealth. That is the meaning of Ndokako. Life is much more than anything. And so it communicates the depth of the Igbo people right there. Like the name of one of the African writers that I mentioned, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the name itself reflects the philosophy of the people, Chimamanda, which means my God will never fail. I always found it very fascinating when the Europeans came to Africa to colonize and to provide what I consider to be Western Christianity. They came up with the narrative that the Igbos were not aware of God and understanding of the supernatural. But names like mine, Uche, names like Chinua Achebe, names like Chimamanda point out to us that there is a philosophy of life, a philosophy that understands the first cause, and a philosophy that recognizes the narrative in relation to the first cause and the ultimate reality. I would like to proceed by looking at the word chi, which is very prevalent in Things Fall Apart, as well as contemporary philosophical narratives among the Igbo people. Chi is considered to mean being. We have Chioma, we have Chi Ndo, we have Chikako. This is always about God and divinity. We could also translate this chi to be image, or what you may consider in Latin to be called the imago Dei, the presence of God in all that we do. You could relate that to the narrative of pantheism, where all is God and God is all. There is always a chi in everything. Chi makes a thing what it is, and that is part of being and reality. It's so fascinating to be able to see this in the philosophy of the Igbo people, as well as African philosophy. Now, another point that I would like to call attention to is the narrative in relation to personhood, which I think is very, very important. For the Igbo people, the human person is called Ma'adu, M-A-D-U, M-A-D-U. And what does that mean? The beauty of life, the beauty of life. Human being, the human person is the beauty of life. The human person lives in fullness of existence in togetherness with other people. I would like to give another example. A human being is not complete without the other. For us in African philosophy, as well as in Igbo philosophy, we talk about it as Mado Ibe. Again, just like what I said before, M-A-D-U, Mado, the beauty of life. And then Ibe, I-B-E, I-B-E. The other person is part of your humanity. The other person is part of who you are. I find that very fascinating with the recent encyclical by an Argentine Pope, Pope Francis, in terms of the idea of fratelli tutti, all are brothers and sisters. You see, that resonates with what the philosophy of the person or personhood for African people and indigenous people of Africa, or in this case, the Igbo people. I would like to move this forward by making reference to the idea of community, because you can't really talk about the person without an essential or intrinsic connection to the community. Like I pointed out, reading the works of Rene Descartes, so much emphasized on an individual, but the Igbo philosophy, as made present in Things Fall Apart, talks about identifying the person as a being of relation, a being of I and thou, a being of I and we, a being of togetherness. In African philosophy, as well as in Igbo philosophy, it talks about this community as umunna, people who are together because they are coming from the same father. Umunna, same father, same God. And then, so it's not just merely a collection of individuals, it is rather a community. And so for the Igbo people, once you think about community, you're talking about a communitarian notion of the person in togetherness, in belongingness, in mutual support, in reciprocity, and in recognition of the identity or the uniqueness of the person, as well as the ability of this person to essentially connect with people around him and with him. Having said that, I would like us to proceed a little more to understanding that this philosophy of community is related to the idea of Ubuntu philosophy. I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. The person does not exist in isolation. He's always in togetherness and in support and in effective interaction with the other. And what does that imply? It means if we recognize one another as part of the community or the communitarian sense, then dialogue, being able to listen to one another, hermeneutics is at the highest level, where dialogue is part of who we are. Ability to relate to one another is part of who we are. You may call this the concept of transcendence, being able to go beyond yourself. The other is not a small O, the other is a big O, just like Emmanuel Levinas would like to point out. So you see the richness of African Igbo philosophy. You see that richness similarly communicated in the views of people like Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas, Gabriel Marcel, and the rest of them. And so what am I getting at? I'm trying to emphasize the uniqueness of African philosophy, Igbo philosophy, as is made present in Things Fall Apart, and also point out that it's not necessarily exclusivist. It's a reminder that even in philosophy of Europe, these things were existent. Maybe as things went on, or based on industrial revolution, people moved from the idea of person as a relatable being to more of person looked as an individual and merely as an individuality. That may be part of the crisis of our world today, and maybe the crisis of Europe. Now, I would like to move this forward. I would like to talk about hope, especially within the context of what transpired in the life of Okonkwo, the main character of Things Fall Apart. As we may recall, he committed suicide because of the terrible situation that he found himself while kind of attacking or confronting the new civilization brought by the Europeans to his community. And so he committed suicide. But I see in the suicide or the tragedy of Okonkwo not necessarily the end of the narrative, but as a way to point out that there is a sense of hope. What does that mean? That in every person, there is a drive. In every person, there is a motivating factor. In every person, there is what you may call the final goal or the purpose of your being. Okonkwo was driven to communicate the narrative of his own people. Okonkwo was driven to protect the culture of his people. Okonkwo was driven to protect the philosophy of life of his own people. But at some point, he was overwhelmed by, so to say, the missionaries and the Europeans in his community. And so taking his own life was his own option. But I don't see that as the end of the narrative. It was actually what gave birth to what we're talking about today, where what I may call the thesis is the colonization. The thesis is Western civilization, or the imposition of Western civilization, or what I also may call Western Christianity, precisely what I call the 3 C's: the C of colonization, the C of civilization, and the C of Christianity. These were the theses that Okonkwo as a persona, as a character in Things Fall Apart, was trying to confront or deal with in order to emphasize the philosophy of his own people, the way of life of his own people. And this becomes, Okonkwo's position becomes the antithesis, something that contradicts directly what has transpired within his own community. And now the synthesis, in my own interpretation of dialectics and dialogue, is what we have today: a culture of mutual deliberation, a culture that recognizes that dialogue is the way forward, a culture that recognizes that pro-European, Eurocentric philosophical perspective is not the one and only truth. It's not the one and only method in terms of getting to the message or getting to reality or getting to the truth of human well-being. That is the point I'm trying to state right there. And so this becomes, for me, the platform to proceed in talking about what I consider as the hermeneutics of hope. The hope that is based on human experience. The tragedy that the African people experienced, the tragedy of losing their language. Like Hans-Georg Gadamer would try to emphasize, language is part of who we are. Language is intrinsic to our humanity. Human beings are linguistic beings. We are not just persons, relational beings. In our relationship with other people, remember when I talk about the Ubuntu, I am because we are, therefore I am. It is because we have a language that we share together. And so for Gadamer, he looks at it as what you may consider to be the outer language and the inner language. You may call it the outer word and then the inner word. And what is that outer word or the outer language? That is the English language I'm speaking right now. And I'm hoping the outer language for you will be the Spanish that you're speaking right now, or maybe the Quechua language that some people, indigenous communities within Argentina will be speaking. So these are considered, or the French language, or maybe any language that you could think about, or the Igbo language. These, according to Gadamer, are considered to be outer language, or even use the Greek word logos propherikos. And now for Gadamer, we have to focus not just on this outer language or outer word. We have to focus on where the message is, or the meaning is, or meaningfulness is present. And that is in the inner word, the inner language, or which is what is at the center of the universality of hermeneutics. The inner word, that's where the meaning is. What I'm saying, what is it that I want to communicate? Every language, every word is trying to communicate thought. That is what is going on. Like the example that I provided, like names like mine, Uche, is communicating thought, the thought of the people. The will of God is not just the word that is being said out there. There is a message, there is a thought behind it, or what the Greeks will call the logos. There is an accountability of the word that I'm communicating, and that is the message. The message is the idea behind it. In Greek, they'll be talking about that as logos in diathetos, the inner word. And that is the interest of philosophical thinking. And that is what Gadamer is very much so interested in. And that is what I'm trying to take up at the present in order to communicate the narrative, not just on language, but on the language of hope for the African people, for the Igbo people. Now, let me proceed with this. In communicating language, in communicating meaning, the Igbo people look at the human person, not just as matter, but the human person as a being of hope. To be a human being is to be a being of hope. I consider that to be the narrative about ontological hope. By the nature of who we are, Mado, we live as the beauty of life. And when you have beauty or ability to shine out, it is an indicative of something that is exciting, something that is fulfilling. I relate this to the idea of hope as ihe, or hope as ihe. I will put it together here as I-H-E, I-H-E. That means Igbo word for reality, entity, essence. And that is the same with light. The equivalent to it will be the German word Dasein, the being that discloses itself, the being that reveals itself. This is just a kind of a comic aspect of my presentation. In the recent narrative in Barbados, one of the well-known singers in Barbados, Rihanna, was recognized as a national hero. And she has a song, Shine Like a Diamond. So I want to borrow that, shine like a diamond. That is essentially who we are. We don't hide ourselves. Our nature of existence, our nature of being is to reveal friendship, is to reveal love. Just like, if I may borrow Fratelli Tutti, the idea of being a human person is to reveal generosity, graciousness, kindness, beauty, and sense of welcome. Having said that, I would like to proceed to the next hermeneutical narrative that I have based on the understanding of hope, the hope provided based on the synthesis between the thesis as well as the antithesis in Things Fall Apart. And what is that? It is hope as nkuzi, hope as Nkuzi. I'm going to spell that Nkuzi.
¿Consideras que podrían no maltratarse?
N
Sería esta, limpiarla por dentro y por fuera,
Z
que huele a humedad.
I.
Es que no sé
Again,
si se les vaya a quitar así como...
N
Tienen puro polvo,
K,
huelen porque pues están en la humedad.
U
Sí,
Z
como tú consideres pertinente.
I.
Otras de que les rocé algo,
Means that hope teaches
pepino o algo, y
Pues
ya
sí,
para
si
que
quieres,
la limpie con
como
el
tú-
trapo.
como
this
tú vayas
is
viendo si no
considered
se
to
manchan,
be
y no
pedagogical
queden como muy, muy
hope.
mojadas.
This is considered to be pedagogical hope, where life teaches us. Life is not just being there. Life is about involvement. The experience of life makes us become better. Life crafts us. And one of my professors as a young philosopher talked about it in the context of Nkuziology, but I think that is kind of a pro-Western way of saying what is familiar with the Igbo people as Nkuzi. So I prefer to stay with the word Nkuzi because I think it communicates the essence and emphasizes linguistic independence of the Igbo people. Isn't that wonderful that we identify ourselves as being or people that learn through our lives experience based on our own historical conditions, based on the realities of our existence? What you may consider as, in this case, African experience is part of the African person becoming a better person. African experience is part of the African person being able to reclaim his cultural identity, his language, and his philosophy of life in order to be able to dialogue with other cultures without any sense of colonization or cultural imperialism or monopoly or monopolization or pro-Western monopolization of philosophy and civilization. One of the German words that come to mind when I think about this hope as Nkuzi is the word like Bildung, which is like to cultivate, to be cultured, to be informed, or to be educated, as the case may be. So that resonates with the idea of Nkuzi for the African people, for the Igbo people. Life forms us. Life's experiences cultivates us. Another word that resonates with it is the word pedagogy, which is paideia, the Greek word paideia, which is related with the idea of education of the young mind, the civilization, so to say, or the information or the development of the young person. That resonates with Nkuziology or Nkuzi for the Igbo people. And then remember, all these diverse languages are independent of the other, but they are still communicating a sense of vibrancy and exciting information, independent of the other. Nkuzi, life teaching you, life helping you becoming a better person, life crafting you, life as part of our becoming. No one is a finished product. We are in the process of total fulfillment. And then the Greeks are looking at it as paideia, pedagogy, and all that stuff. And then independently, the Germans are looking at it as building, education, culture, or cultivating something. Now, the third point that I will reflect on is what I consider as the hermeneutical theme on the idea of hope, hope as nchekube, hope as nchekube. At the end of my slide today, I would like to show that to us. I'll push it a little bit forward so that we have the spellings right. So I'll put it right here. These are the spellings to help us. The third one is hope as nchekube. I call that anthropological understanding of hope. So for the Igbos, this is where the idea of to be a person is to live in continuity. It's about dialogical existentialism. In living with one another, we mold ourselves. We become better people. We inform ourselves. independent of dialogue and dialectic, the person becomes merely an individual. The person merely becomes a unit of a collective group and not necessarily an essential part of a community or the communitarian notion of the person. This narrative about Nchekube, even though I consider it anthropological, you may look at it as futuristic notion of hope. Hope ordinarily implies a sense of optimism, if I may put it this way, a sense of optimism, a sense of something to be accomplished in the future. And that is the point right here. The better African person, the better hermeneutic philosophy, the better philosophy of life is an ongoing project. It is part of our human becoming. And that human becoming is essentially part of what you may consider to be a civilization of love. It is what you may consider to be fratelli tutti, social love. It is what is at the heart of Gadamer's project, universal hermeneutics, universality in hermeneutics, in which the common language that we all speak will be more about the language of dialogue, the language of mutual recognition, the language of being able to fusion our horizons, the language of making the world a better place. Having said that, I would like to proceed to what I consider to be the narrative about theories of truth, as well as emphasizing what I consider to be the hermeneutical theory of truth. I will move this backward a little bit because I wanted us to get the spellings, the Igbo spellings for some of the concepts in relation to hope in Igbo philosophy. So I'll put it this way. Okay, here, I'll just go through some of the basic issues, but my target is with hermeneutic truth. We already know about metaphysical truth or universal truth. They are like mathematical truth. 2 plus 2 it has to be 4, because that is what essentially what by nature, it is intrinsic to truth. You may call it, you may call it inherent truth, because it's based on the nature of a thing, the ontology of a thing. For example, if I use the word or the concept triangle, it has to be a figure that has 3 sides. Whether you are in Argentina, whether you are in Nigeria, whether you are in South Africa, or whether you are in the UK. So that is the common ground. That is the common reality that we look at. This aspect of truth or understanding of truth, according to Hans-Georg Gadamer, we don't really have a problem with that. That is a common ground. If it is metaphysical, if it is ontological, if it is universal, then it is unchangeable, it is permanent, it's the same for every person across cultures and communities, across civilizations. So for Gadamer, no crisis right here. Where the issue is dealing with the gray areas of our human existence, dealing with the gray areas of our human existence, which is the dialogue that we have to have in order for the truth to emerge. And that I have considered to be the hermeneutic truth, the truth that emerges because we're able to discuss. For example, my presentation today, looking at names like Okonkwo, through dialogue, one is able to see the meaningfulness in the names like Uche, names like Ndokako, names like Chimamanda. They communicate message that someone who is Eurocentric, someone who is strictly Eurocentric or pro-Western, closing his ears and eyes will never get to see. But that truth can only emerge when we dialogue with one another, when we listen to one another, and to see that truth is not just metaphysical or mathematical stuff. Truth has a human dimension, and that human dimension is so dynamic. So there has to be a kind of a public debate or public discourse in order for us to arrive at it. Now, the next theory of truth that I would like to talk about is the coherence theory of truth. It merely means the idea of to cohere or to add up, a sense of unity. You may see that a lot in logic. Aristotle's logic, considered in words like syllogism. All men are mortal. John or Uche is a man, therefore Uche is mortal. Carlos is a man, therefore Carlos is mortal. As long as you identify the initial premise that is all-inclusive. And so that is the point. If you say all universities are places of intellectual exercise, then it implies that Universidad Nacional de San Martín is a place of intellectual exercise. You cannot take that away in terms of that syllogism or in that narrative. That is the idea of coherence theory of truth. Now, the other point that I would like to look at is the correspondence theory of truth. This was actually promoted very significantly by the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. His idea of correspondence, agreement, harmony. You may call it also unity, correspondence, harmony. And so for Thomas Aquinas, he looks at it from the perspective of adequatio rei et intellectus, the correspondence between what is said and what is out there in re and in mentis, physically, and what is in mind. When there is a correspondence between these two aspects of reality, then you have the truth. For example, if I were to say that Argentina is in South America, I said it, all you have to do is to check it, and you're able to find that out. If I were to say that your university is a university, what do I have to do? And it is located in a particular city, in Buenos Aires, then I have to check that to correspond what has been said. If I say it is snowing out there, all you have to do is to check through the window and find out if it is the case. And that is the idea of correspondence, adequatio, harmony between what is said and what is out there. And this could be related to empirical truth or the truth based on science, because science is about verification or verifiability. What is said and what is truly out there if there is a correspondence. And then, or if there is a harmony. Then the last one is pragmatic theory of truth, just like the name pragma. I think the Greek word, the idea of function, the idea of what works, whatever that adds value. And so that means that truth is only that which works. If it doesn't work, then it is not necessarily true. You could consider that as a subjective understanding of truth. It's not the same with the metaphysical, ontological, universal notion of truth, because this applies to persons, or you may call them quote unquote, individuals in their various subjective conditions. So for example, if I were to tell my students maybe a story in order to help them understand the message, maybe that story didn't really happen, but it helps them to understand the story. In that sense, that is truth because it works. If I were to give my little brother or my little kid maybe a kind of tablet, giving the person the impression that that is the ideal tablet taken by grandma or grandpa in order to calm my little boy down or my little brother down, then that is pragmatic truth because it works. It calms the person down. You may relate this to the idea of propaganda. Sometimes propaganda has a positive side, especially looking at it from Plato's Republic, the example of the noble lie, where people were meant to understand they have the same nature, but they have different metals in them, the metal of gold, the metal of silver, and the metal of bronze. In other words, trying to show that humanity is coming from the same source, but with different or diverse dispositions or talent. That worked in that society in that sense, it becomes a pragmatic truth. You may relate that to the negative understanding of propaganda, where politicians tell people what they need to hear in order for them to get the votes of the people. As long as it works in that sense, that is pragmatic notion of truth. If you look at all these distinctive theories of truth, hermeneutic truth doesn't have a lot of things to do with negative pragmatic theory of truth, but it has a lot in terms of positive understanding of propaganda, where you give people what they need to know in order to understand reality within their own context or condition of existence. Hermeneutics is not worried about the metaphysical notion of truth or universal, because it thinks that is not the area of diversity and confusion or conflict. Those areas are so clear. The hermeneutic truth makes use of coherence, going back and forth, looking at the whole and the part, and then looking at the part as well as the whole, going back and forth in order to arrive at reality. A hermeneutic notion of truth also makes use of the idea of the correspondence, because it's very important to check the facts and to arrive at the totality of truth, which is the totality of message. Having said that, I would like to proceed with my concluding remark. Remember, I tried to show this page earlier just to help us get used to the Igbo words, ihe, nkuzi, and nchekube. In final remark, the idea of Hans-Georg Gadamer is about establishing a culture of dialogue, establishing a culture that is not so much about Eurocentric, pro-Western civilization or pro-Western understanding of reality. That is only, like Germans would say, ein Stück is just a part of reality. There is no one culture that has a total conception of reality. It's only a horizon, a perspective. We need to combine these horizons in order to understand the totality of reality. And how do we go about it? By recognizing the independence of every outer word or physical language or the diverse languages of the world, because human beings, we are linguistic beings, and our language communicates our philosophy, and our philosophy is how we understand reality. It may not be a totality of reality, but it has to be done with authentic freedom, authentic liberty, and authentic pursuit of genuine human happiness. That is what is very, very essential. And that should be central in the philosophy of the present. So Hans-Georg Gadamer has provided us a platform to welcome other cultures and philosophies. And then Chinua Achebe's text is just to let us know that every text, every written material, every person's voice is part of the narrative that we have to pay attention to in order to come to this civilization of love, a community of human persons, not a community of individual. It's not a collectivity. It is actually, like Pope Francis, the Argentine would say, fratelli tutti, brotherhood, a social love that is about the message of unity, peace, and human development. This is where I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stanley. Wonderful. Laura, ¿quieres continuar?
Laura, would you like to take the floor, take it over? Thank you very much. So we're now going to open up the floor to questions, comments. Please, you're more than welcome to pour any comments in the chat box if you prefer to do that, or raise your hands to make questions. And you can either make the question in whichever language you feel more comfortable with, either language or Spanish. Pedro Alberti is thanking you for the excellent presentation. Gabriela Lecton also echoes those words. Excellent. Thank you for this beautiful contribution. Sylvia Leth, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Stanley, for an absolutely wonderful, wonderful presentation. And I have a couple questions and comments. It's being here in Argentina, it has a particular resonance, what you talk about, because of a history of colonialism in Latin America. So a lot of what you say has so much to do with the experience here. And particular for me, because I am an anthropologist and I work with indigenous people, so I really understood that. So I was thinking about this South-South dialogue that is so much talked about, but not enacted enough. Gabriela earlier talked about the publications that were going to be, and the works of African writers published here, but I think there's still not enough of that dialogue in those terms that you spoke about, because there's work like yours, and there's been people in Latin America that have published in this, and I was wondering a little bit about that. Now, what was happening in terms of that lack, perhaps, of enough dialogue in these same terms. The other thing I wanted to mention, two other things. Maybe about 25 years ago, I was teaching in the United States, and I was asked to teach Things Fall Apart. And when I read it, to me, it was wonderful. It had so much resonance, and I really understood it. But it didn't happen that way with the students. This was in New Jersey. I was teaching this course, and I thought, why are students really connecting to this book the way we could understand it? Even if it's Africa and it's different, we could understand it in Latin America, as I told you before, because of that colonial experience. And I was wondering what your experience has been with teaching the book there. And the third thing that I wanted to ask you about, because you were talking about the hermeneutics of hope and mentioning this idea of community and unity and peace, what about evil? And what about the presence of evil in general, and specifically in Igbo culture?
Okay.
I'm referring to the practices that surround the idea of whatever you want to call it, witchcraft or sorcery, or the idea that people are also born with evil.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, let me address your question. Can you hear me? Right. The first question is about my pedagogical experience in teaching Things Fall Apart, or even indigenous philosophies where I am. Based on my historical narrative, I love bringing cultural differences to what I teach. Especially, I was fascinated when I was in New Jersey that they were able to allow me use a work by Robert Solomon and Kathleen Higgins. So this is the big questions, the big problems in philosophy and all that stuff. He talks about, or they talked about, the idea of philosophy of diversity, the philosophy of culture, or what some people may consider as aspects of philosophy of race. And so I naturally bring this to my teaching and my interaction with students. And like you may know, in a multicultural world, you have students from all over the world. You have Chinese students, you have Mexican students, you have students from Latin America, you have all over the world. And I find that as a beautiful thing in the terms like being able to use different languages to communicate the ideas in the text. So it's not just the Greek or Hebrew or Latin. It also look at it from, for example, recently we were talking about fratelli tutti. And I asked one of the students, was the word for friendship in Spanish? It was good to be able to get the word amistad or something like that, amigo, friend, and all that. It resonates with the soul of the student, because to be a person is to be a linguistic being. When I'm teaching like concept like phronesis or even what Aristotle may call the idea of dialectics or doctrine of the mean. I use the Chinese word wu wei, which is about adaptability, not necessarily being passive, but being able to adapt, being able to be aware of that the human existence is a totality. It's not me, myself, and I. And so when I'm teaching philosophy, I try to bring in people like Octavio Paz, a Mexican philosopher and writer. In other words, it resonates with the students in order to see that reality is not just understood from a particular language or particular community. I've also taught courses in relation to people like Paulo Freire, in relation to the idea of pedagogy of the oppressed, or the idea of conscientizazo, which helps students to see that knowledge has to go with intellectual liberation, mental freedom. For example, the work by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I find that very interesting. It calls decolonizing the mind. And for you to decolonize the mind of even the colonizers as well as the colonized, one should be able to make references to the liberating capacity of the various languages. Having said that, I would like to proceed with another aspect of your question. If I understood you well, it's about evil in Igbo philosophy. Is that correct?
Yes, and the presence, the idea of evil together with the idea of good at the same time.
Of course, yeah, of course, yeah. There seems to be a kind of dipolarity where if you have the good, and then by implication there should be the other aspect of it, or what I presented in my paper as the idea of thesis and antithesis. In Igbo philosophy, as much as I know about it, being or ihe essentially goes with the good. It is the good that discloses itself. It is the good that reveals itself. The bad has to, or the evil has to, so to say, hide. The evil is associated with darkness. Probably this is why it is kind of philosophically irresponsible to associate the bad with, like in Western narrative, some people associate the bad with dark and being black and all that stuff. I find that not really connecting. But within the Igbo philosophy, yes, there is the good that has to reveal itself. There is the bad that has to hide. Like we have Chi Oma, the good being, and we have Chi Ojo, the bad being. The bad being is part or responsible for the things that, or the evil or the atrocious things that people do in the community. But the essential thing is within Igbo philosophy, the bad is not the end of it all. The bad is a distortion of the good, if I'm gonna put it, not necessarily a distortion or destruction of the good, but in terms of presenting the good, or even like Augustine talked about the evil as privation of the good. That resonates with African philosophy, that resonates with Igbo philosophy. Some have even gone ahead to argue that Augustine actually addressed some of these issues with some knowledge based on his African background, as the case may be. What am I trying to get at? Evil is not a reality of its own. It is a distortion. And so at the end of the day, the good overrides the evil. And within Igbo culture, when through my actions, I have generated negative or evil consequences in my community, there has to be a process of purification, which means evil or the terrible is not the end of it all. For example, in Things Fall Apart, when Okonkwo committed suicide, there was also the process of purifying the land through rituals, through sacrifices, through appeasing the god. When Okonkwo was rough on one of his wives, he also had to make a sacrifice in order to make sure that the good triumphs over that which is evil, over that which is bad. I don't know if I answered your question in that sense.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Muchas gracias, Silvia.
Thank you so much, Silvia. We have also thanks from Gadila Layton, from Iria, from Elliot Jacks to Emilia. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's really fascinating talk. And I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian. But obviously I also live in the world and observe what's happening in the world. And in your conceptualization of Western individualism and how the Ubuntu philosophy constructs the world, it made me think about how this idea of agency comes into it, because it's such a pervasive and element of Western conceptualization that individuals have agency. And that's so important to claim that agency also over other people and trampling over them. And somehow worth of a person can be also established through this greater agency than others. How is agency then conceptualized in Ubuntu? So if I exist because we exist, how does the agency, individual agency, come into it? Not at all. Is it understood somehow differently?
Right, thank you for your question. The idea of agency is ontologically associated with the notion of the person, or mado, like I presented in Igbo philosophy, the beauty of life. And then mado ibe, the other is part of you. I am not complete if you are not part of my journey, if you are not part of my existence. So for Igbo philosophy and much about African philosophy, there is a clear-cut distinction between individualism and personhood. And so, but we have to be careful that when we make the distinction between individual and personhood, or human being or human person, it's not the same thing with individuality. So individual and individuality, they are not used interchangeably in this context. So the individuality is the uniqueness. Or I think the German word that comes to mind is Selbstständigkeit, as the case may be, selfhood, the Einmaligkeit, you being unique, and that is your personhood. Some may call that personality, and that carries with it a moral agency, ability to treat others well. Think about the golden rule. It has to apply in that sense. And the equivalent of that golden rule could be considered to be this Ubuntu philosophy. I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. So at every point of my interpersonal relationship with the other should never be seen as a means to an end. Like Immanuel Kant will look at it as end in themselves. We are ends in ourselves. So also with Igbo philosophy of person and African philosophy of the person. Whatever you do, you have to do it in a moral way. Even the political activities, even the cultural activities, even, of course, the religious activities that are essential part of the person. So this is how I'll answer the question. Moral agency is about our ability to relate with one another, being ethical, being friendly, being dialogical, being responsible, and making the world a better place. And that is also part of the idea of the philosophy or the hermeneutics of hope that I pointed out, being the light of the word and living to be influenced by that word. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Gracias. Sí, Carlos.
Muchas gracias, Stanley. Tengo muchas
Thank you
preguntas.
so much, Stanley.
Tengo muchas preguntas.
I have several questions,
Quisiera hacerte algunas preguntas
but I would
vinculadas a
like
la
to
novela
make a question related to the novel and your interpretation regarding your novel, and Chino Achere. There's actually a kind of one of the protagonists and the characters actually, that is Obiedita, that interacts, and Kwonko has to do, or who dares do or carry out the assassination or the murder in order to reestablish the peace between two communities. And he does this in order to respect the laws of his own tradition. Therefore, it is, so to speak, implicit in a way, something that is necessary, and that is that when an act is committed that breaches that peaceful situation or context, that needs to be repaired or redressed, and therefore justice, what we call justice, should be made, but I would call it redress or repair, and go back to striking that balance as of the imbalance that has triggered another assassination. So then they need to come or bring in a young woman and carry out another sacrifice. So Nkonko goes ahead and does this. And as of the dialogue between Onyedika and Nkonko, I see that Onyedika has a different relation with her tradition, which is actually a critical relationship with her tradition, because he does not agree. Well, I mean, he's in agreement that there needs to be a peace that needs to be restored and need to be back a balance between the communities, but not in a way that the tradition was actually approaching that. So that there needs to be a way around it through different means. So the question is the following: the person, as you describe in your book, and you've also mentioned this in your presentation, throughout your presentation, in Equo, is called the beauty of life. But the beauty of life would actually be in harmony with the community. And the problem, or the mistake, or the perspective, the kind of the ill-placed perspective from Nkonko, is an obedience to tradition that ultimately seems to cuts him out or cuts him away from the humanity, because he takes actions in his own hands and he acts in order to become a hero. And in that obedience call, individualistic act and call towards obedience, he breaks down, well, he breaks with tradition, because he breaks down with that community sense. And I would like to ask if this understanding on my end is really far from what it should be, or what is your thought about that?
All right, thank you, Carlos. I think you are right on, especially using the tools of hermeneutics. As long as Okonkwo was pursuing his own selfish interest, pride, and power, he loses, so to say, his human personhood and becomes merely an individual. Remember, his personality is his individuality, but his pursuit of his selfish interest makes him merely an object, or an individual in this case. And so that is part of the crisis. And so through his actions, he violated the peace or the community or the harmony that should exist within the land. Like you rightly pointed out, within Igbo philosophy, things are not totally lost. There is always an alternative. There is a way of reparation. There is a way of rehabilitation. There is a way, you may call it restorative, reparative, reconciliatory form of justice that puts everything in place. Another point that I would like to put across, just to encourage your position or to enrich it, is that even within the community, they had opportunities to continue to consult with the gods of the land in order to have an enriched understanding of what exactly the deities or the god of the land would like them to actually do. Would they necessarily have to kill the boy Ikemefuna, or should they perform a different kind of sacrifice? But here, remember, Okonkwo was kind of, so to say, infatuated with this ego and macho personage that he was so much interested in and wanted to protect. That is not technically Igbo culture or African philosophy. That is actually his own pursuing his own interest, or so to say, identity or interpretation of reality. So a consultation with the higher deity would have enriched his understanding as a becoming being. And this makes reference to the point, the role that Obierika, the friend of Okonkwo, played in the narrative. He was able to calm Okonkwo down and also provide alternative interpretation that Okonkwo should be able to pay attention to, have a dialogue to, in order to be able to enrich his response to the problems of his time and the situation that he has found himself in at the time.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Santiago. Gracias, Carlos. Gracias, Stanley.
Thank you, Santiago. Thank you, Stanley.
That was so enlightening. I have a question concerning specifically, let's say, African philosophy and what you've shared with us. And it concerns the limits of hermeneutics. I wonder, because you talked about Levinas and Buber, no?
Yeah.
And I wonder, because I feel that in your exposition, there is definitely a rational, logical foundation. That's what I felt. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I wonder if all this in the history of philosophy, no, and I understand that African philosophy is there to not criticize, but to have something different, some otherwise to say, some otherwise than logos, otherwise than reason, otherwise than West. So I wonder if all the history of philosophy has been based upon this logic human being. No? You're a human being, you're rational, you're logical in the sense of logos. You have a logos. No? I wonder if that definition us to the present time. I mean, that maybe we're not logical, we're not reasonable, we're not rational, in the sense that what we do, what is more important for us, like love, like beauty, are not rational. There are no words to express love. We say love, but that doesn't mean anything. Love is something that we do, that we make, not that we speak. So in the same sense of beauty, you know, when there's something so beautiful, you don't have words to describe. But we are reminded by Western philosophy, in the whole history of philosophy, that we are rational, that things are for a reason. And maybe those things that are for a reason are marketable, no? Well, I'll give you this, you give me back. But what really defines us as human beings is gratuitous. It's gratuity, is unreasonable, is irrational, and is not possible, is not sayable. There's nothing to say. There is no possible dialogue. Love is bigger and universal. So what would, you know, this philosophical, this African philosophy, what could it say to the limits of hermeneutics, or the necessity to always fall back on reason, fall back on logos? Isn't there something else that maybe African philosophy could say about human beings that is not rational, that is not logical, etc.? Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much for your question. I think that African philosophy understands as well as communicates that logos is not the totality of definition of what it means to be a person. But logos is necessary, but it's not sufficient. That's the subtle distinction I would like to make there. It's necessary, but not sufficient. But it is part of who we are, especially when I made reference to the idea of language. So logos, lingua, language, they go together. Word, reason, thought, accountability, communication, message. As long as we speak a language, there has to be a logic to that language. There has to be a system to that logic or to that communication of idea. So that's the point I would like to put across. Then the other aspect of it, like I also pointed out, we cannot define ourselves as cogito ergo sum alone, as René Descartes will point out. Human being is not just a combination for the African people. It's not a combination of body and soul, if soul is for thought, and then the body is kind of the physical extension of matter. The human person is an amalgam, is a complex being of both reason or mind, spirit, body, consciousness, affective dimensions, emotions, and all that stuff. So that is what I mean, that is actually a complex notion of the person. In other words, like you made reference to the idea that not everything that we can talk about is logical. I may put it this way: there is the logical and the illogical, the rational and the irrational dimension of what it means to be a human being. And so you making reference to a concept that I think was very prevalent in the recent encyclical of Pope Francis, the graciousness. I find that very fascinating. The irrational, unreasonable, illogical dimension of the human person really takes care of that, because not everything can be methodologically explained, but they are there, their presence is there. And that is why within the African philosophy, as well as the Igbo philosophy, there is the spirit world where we have to kind of dialogue with in order to have a better understanding of that which is beyond human logic. Now, another thing that is very interesting, even though we say things are beyond human logic, they may actually make sense in the divine domain. It's just that they are limited because we are finite creatures. So logos may be, just like Philo will point out, there is the eternal logos, the eternal thou, just like Martin Buber. So that is also logos, but it's not within the parameters of human capacity. So that is how I may address that. You may reference that to the idea of the hierarchy of being by someone like Thomas Aquinas. And I see that in African philosophy, Chioma, Chiojo, the interactions of the good and the bad, and being able to discern the fullness of meaning by consulting with the supernatural in order to understand that which may be irrational or non-logical to the physical person, as the case may be. I don't know if I answered your question in that regard.
Thank you so much, Stanley. Thank you so much.
Another point that I would like to add there, in the recent work by Amartya Sen wrote the book, The Idea of Justice. He also made reference to that we have to be able to look at things not just from this logos pro-Western perspective alone. We have to look at it like when he made a distinction between niti and nyaya in relation to understanding justice. So justice is not merely the structural stuff, but it's also the going back and forth, the process, the procedure, the hands-on understanding of it based on public debate, public discussion, and which is all about, so to say, enhancing justice as well as removing injustice. So at the end of the day, it's about making the world a better place. And that is going beyond a kind of logos of the Western philosophy to, if I'm gonna put it this way, the non-logos of other cultural philosophical traditions.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Raquel agradece la presentación y felicita.
We thank you for your presentation. Thank you so much. We congratulate you for your brilliant presentation. Written in the chat to all of you who have joined us today, we thank you so much for being with us, for free dialogue and open dialogue. Your presence gives us the strength to continue forward.
Bueno, si te parece, Carlos, vamos liberándolo a Stanley.
Well, Carlos, we can say goodbye to Stanley. We have 5 minutes if you want to make further comments, ask additional questions, because I would like to briefly ask you something, Stanley. You proposed that we have to read Gadamer's philosophy as the philosophy of hope based on dialogue, of course, a dialogue between cultures beyond the differences of language or cultural differences. My question is the following. Do you think that we can attempt reading Gadamer, or the second parts of his book, putting the focus on the understanding and consent, something that is before the agreement?
Could you repeat the
Try
question?
to just to ask you if it would be possible that when reading Gadamer, we put focus on the idea that to have a philosophy of hope and love, to achieve this, then we would have to make emphasis first, or in a more extent, on consent that we provide in the Einfunction, that is to say that we provide consent to establish dialogue, so then we can have the agreement, which does not mean that we all have to think alike, of course.
Right.
So can we make this distinction?
Right. If I understood your question, yes, absolutely. The main thing is based on my emphasis on the nature of the human person. So the human person has always been a being of hope. The human person has always been a being of becoming a being that actualizes himself or herself in the present as well as in the future. And so that should be, so to say, our historical condition, our hermeneutical condition in reading any text, in dialoguing with anybody. And so that is the promise. It's a sense of transcendence that is there. It is actually means, this sense of hope is the sense of openness. So it's like if I close my hands this way, then I can't really receive. But if I keep it open, then there'll be probably a handshake or receiving something from you or from someone else. So in that sense, yes, the idea of hope is very, very important in order to make dialogue possible, understanding possible, and meaningfulness possible. That is also helpful because it's all about getting rid of our self-enclosedness, self-isolation based on bias, selfish interests, and preferences.
Muchas gracias. Vamos entonces.
Thank you so much.
You're
We are
welcome.
reading all of the comments, thanking everyone, and thanking especially thanking you, Stanley, once again. And of course, if anyone would like to open your microphones to express your thanks, although there will be a mixture of voices, but of course, we welcome you to do so, since this is a farewell and this is a way we wrap up our academic year. Also thanking everyone for having joined us, and hopefully will be joining us next year.
We can find the possibility to have another lecture and discussion between us, because really it's amazing, your proposal. Yeah, and perhaps you can be also for us a bridge between us and other African authors. And with the time out of pandemic, we have our visit with us.
Can I say something? Is that?
Sí, cómo no.
Of course. Go ahead, please.
I would like to use this time to say a big thank you to Carlos Ruta, to Marina Mayer, to every one of you who has played a very significant role to make it possible for me to present today's paper. I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to future interactions. And like Carlos pointed out, I'll be excited to play a mediation role to bring to your campus, bring to your availability African scholars and African authors that can make the philosophy of plurality and inclusiveness an essential part of our humanity and the project of making the world a better place. Mucho gracias. Danke schön. Chuku goziuno. Ndewono. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias,
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stanley. Thanks. Excellent work. Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Very, very good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.